having used 1/3 of its fuel. It is a common misconception that the planes refueled shortly after takeoff because the jet fuel leaked. The leaking of fuel was caused by failure of sealant due to the high heat and expansion during flight. However, the amount of fuel that leaked was not enough to make refueling necessary. The planes refueled because the maximum speeds of the aircraft were only possible with aerial refueling. The SR-71 also required in-flight refueling to replenish fuel during long-duration missions. Supersonic flights generally lasted no more than 90 minutes before the pilot had to find a tanker. Specialized KC-135Q tankers were required to refuel the SR-71. The KC-135Q had a modified high-speed boom, which would allow refueling of the Blackbird at nearly the tanker's maximum airspeed with minimum flutter. The tanker also had special fuel systems for moving JP4, for the KC-135Q itself, and JP7, for the SR-71, between different tanks. As an aid to the pilot when refueling, the cockpit was fitted with a peripheral vision horizon display. This unusual instrument projected a barely visible artificial horizon line across the top of the entire instrument panel, which gave the pilot subliminal cues on aircraft attitude. Astro-Inertial Navigation System, EDIT. Nortronics, Northrop Corporation's Electronics Development Division, had developed an astro-inertial guidance system, ANS, which could correct inertial navigation system errors with celestial observations, for the SM-62 SNAC missile, and a separate system for the ill-fated AGM-48 Skybolt missile, the latter of which was adapted for the SR-71. Before takeoff, a primary alignment brought the ANS's inertial components to a high degree of accuracy. In flight, the ANS, which sat behind the reconnaissance systems officers, RSOs, position, tracked stars through a circular quartz glass window on the upper fuselage. Its blue light source star tracker, which could see stars during both day and night, would continuously track a variety of stars as the aircraft's changing position brought them into view. The system's digital computer ephemeris contained data on a list of stars used for celestial navigation. The list first included 56 stars and was later expanded to 61. The ANS could supply altitude and position to flight controls and other systems, including the mission data recorder, automatic navigation to preset destination points, automatic pointing and control of cameras and sensors, and optical or SLR sighting of fixed points loaded into the ANS before takeoff. According to Richard Graham, a former SR-71 pilot, the navigation system was good enough to limit drift to 1,000 feet, 300 m, of the direction of travel at Mach 3. Sensors and payloads, edit. The SR-71 originally included optical forward/infrared imagery systems, side-looking airborne radar, SLR, electronic intelligence, ELINT, gathering systems, defensive systems for countering missile and airborne fighters, and recorders for SLR, ELINT, and maintenance data. The SR-71 carried a fairkill tracking camera and an infrared camera, both of which ran during the entire mission. As the SR-71 had a second cockpit behind the pilot for the RSO, it could not carry the A-12's principal sensor, a single large focal-length optical camera that sat in the Q bay behind the A-12's single cockpit. Instead, the SR-71's camera systems could be located either in the fuselage chines or the removable nose forward/chine section. Wide area imaging was provided by two of ITEC's operational objective cameras, which provided stereo imagery across the width of the flight track, or an ITEC optical bar camera, which gave continuous horizon-to-horizon coverage. A closer view of the target area was given by the High-Con Technical Objective Camera, TOC, which could be directed up to 45 degrees left or right of the center line. Initially, the TEOCs could not match the resolution of the A-12's larger camera, but rapid improvements in both the camera and film improved this performance. SR, built by Goodyear Aerospace, could be carried in the removable nose. In later life, the radar was replaced by L'Oreal's Advanced Synthetic Aperture Radar System, SR-1. Both the first SR and SR-1 were ground mapping imaging systems, collecting data either in fixed swaths left or right of centerline or from a spot location for high resolution. Element gathering systems, called the Electromagnetic Reconnaissance System, built by AIL, could be carried in the chine bays to analyze electronic signal fields being passed through, and were programmed to identify items of interest. Over its operational life, the Blackbird carried various electronic countermeasures, ECMs, including warning and active electronic systems built by several ECM companies and called systems A2, A2C, B, C, C2, E, G, H, and M. On a given mission, an aircraft carried several of these frequency forward/purpose payloads to meet the expected threats. Major Jerry Crew, an RSO, told Air and Space Forward/Smithsonian that he used a jammer to try to confuse surface-to-air missile sites as their crews tracked his airplane, but once his threat warning receiver told him a missile had been launched, he switched off the jammer to prevent the missile from homing in on its signal. After landing, information from the SR, element gathering systems, and the maintenance data recorder were subjected to post-flight ground analysis. In the later years of its operational life, a data link system could send SR-1 and ELINT data from about 2,000 mi, 3,700 kilometers, of track coverage to a suitably equipped ground station. Life support, edit. Flying at 80,000 feet, 24,000 m, meant that crews could not use standard masks, which could not provide enough oxygen above 43,000 feet, 13,000 m. Specialized protective pressurized suits were produced for crew members by the David Clark Company for the A-12, YF-12, M-21 and SR-71. Furthermore, an emergency ejection at Mach 3.2 would subject crews to temperatures of about 450 degrees Fahrenheit, 230 degrees Celsius. Thus, during a high-altitude ejection scenario, an onboard oxygen supply would keep the suit pressurized during the descent. The cockpit could be pressurized to an altitude of 10,000 or 26,000 feet, 3,000 or 8,000 m, during flight. The cabin needed a heavy-duty cooling system, as cruising at Mach 3.2 would heat the aircraft's external surface well beyond 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 260 degrees Celsius, and the inside of the windshield to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 120 degrees Celsius. An air conditioner used a heat exchanger to dump heat from the cockpit into the fuel prior to combustion. The same air conditioning system was also used to keep the front, nose, landing gear bay cool, thereby eliminating the need for the special aluminum impregnated tires similar to those used on the main landing gear. Blackbird pilots and RSOs were provided with food and drink for the long reconnaissance flights. Water bottles had long straws which crew members guided into an opening in the helmet by looking in a mirror. Food was contained in sealed containers similar to toothpaste tubes which delivered food to the crew member's mouth through the helmet opening. Operational history, edit. Main era, edit. The first flight of an SR-71 took place on the 22nd of December, 1964, at USAF Plant 42 in Palmdale, California, piloted by Bob Gilliland. The SR-71 reached a top speed of Mach 3.4 during flight testing, with pilot Major Brian Shaw reporting a speed in excess of Mach 3.5 on an operational sortie while evading a missile over Libya. The first SR-71 to enter service was delivered to the 4200th, later, 9th, Strategic Reconnaissance Wing at Beale Air Force Base, California, in January 1966. SR-71s first arrived at the 9th SRW's operating location, OL-8, at Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, Japan on the 8th of March 1968. These deployments were codenamed Glowing Heat, while the program as a whole was codenamed Senior Crown. Reconnaissance missions over North Vietnam were codenamed Black Shield and then renamed Giant Scale in late 1968. On the 21st of March 1968, Major, later General, Jerome F. O'Malley and Major Edward D. Payne flew the first operational SR-71 sortie in SR-71 serial number 61 to 7976 from Kadena AFB, Okinawa. During its career, this aircraft, 976, accumulated 2,981 flying hours and flew 942 total sorties, more than any other SR-71, including 257 operational missions, from Beale AFB, Palmdale, California, Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, Japan, and IAF Mildenhall, UK. The aircraft was flown to the National Museum of the United States Air Force near Dayton, Ohio in March 1990. The USAF could fly each SR-71, on average, once per week, because of the extended turnaround required after mission recovery. Very often an aircraft would return with rivets missing, delaminated panels or other broken parts such as inlets requiring repair or replacement. There were cases of the aircraft not being ready to fly again for a month due to the repairs needed. Rob Vermeland, Lockheed Martin's manager of Advanced Development Program, said in an interview in 2015 that high-tempo operations were not realistic for the SR-71. If we had one sitting in the hangar here and the crew chief was told there was a mission planned right now, then 19 hours later it would be safely ready to take off. From the beginning of the Blackbird's reconnaissance missions over North Vietnam and Laos in 1968, the SR-71s averaged approximately one sortie a week for nearly 2 years. By 1970, the SR-71s were averaging 2 sorties per week, and by 1972, they were flying nearly 1 sortie every day. 2 SR-71s were lost during these missions, one in 1970 and the second aircraft in 1972, both due to mechanical malfunctions. Over the course of its reconnaissance missions during the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese fired approximately 800 SAMs at SR-71s, none of which managed to score a hit. Pilots did report that missiles launched without radar guidance and no launch detection had passed as close as 150 yards, 140 m, from the aircraft. While deployed at Okinawa, the SR-71s and their aircrew members gained the nickname Habu, as did the A-12s preceding them, after a Pit Viper indigenous to Japan, which the Okinawans thought the plane resembled. Operational highlights for the entire Blackbird family, YF-12, A-12, and SR-71, as of about 1990 included 3,551 mission sorties flown, 17,300 total sorties flown, 11,008 mission flight hours, 53,490 total flight hours, 2,752 hours Mach 3 time, missions, 11,675 hours Mach 3 time, total. Only one crew member, Shimswaya, a Lockheed flight test reconnaissance and navigation systems specialist, was killed in a flight accident. The rest of the crew members ejected safely or evacuated their aircraft on the ground. An SR-71 was used domestically in 1971 to assist the FBI in their manhunt for the skyjacker D.B. Cooper. The Blackbird was to retrace and photograph the flight path of the hijacked 727 from Seattle to Reno and attempt to locate any of the items that Cooper was known to have parachuted with from the aircraft. 5 flights were attempted, but on each occasion no photographs of the flight path were obtained due to low visibility. European flights, edit. European operations were flown from RAF Mildenhall, England. There were 2 weekly routes. One was along the Norwegian west coast and up the Kola Peninsula, which contained several large naval bases belonging to the Soviet Navy's Northern Fleet. Over the years, there were several emergency landings in Norway, 4 in Bod and 2 of them in 1981, flying from Biel, and 1985. Rescue parties were sent in to repair the planes before leaving. On one occasion, one complete wing with engine was replaced as the easiest way to get the plane airborne again. The other route was known as the Baltic Express. It started from Mildenhall and went through Jutland and the Danish Straits before going out over the Baltic Sea. At the time, the USSR controlled the airspace from the DDR and to the Gulf of Finland, with both Finland and Sweden pursuing neutrality in the Cold War. This meant that NATO aircraft entering the Baltic Sea had to fly through a narrow corridor of international airspace between Scania and Western Pomerania, which was monitored by both the Swedish and Soviet air forces. Starting a counterclockwise 30-minute loop, the Blackbirds would then reconnoiter along the Soviet Union's coastal border, before slowing down to Mach 2.54 to make a left turn south of Åland, and then follow the Swedish coast back towards Denmark. If the SR-71s attempted the turn at Mach 3, they could end up violating Swedish airspace, and the Swedes would direct Viggens to intercept the offending aircraft. The combination of a monitored entry point and a fixed route allowed the Swedes and the Soviets a chance to scramble interceptors. Swedish radar stations would observe the 15th Air Army dispatch Su-15s from Latvia, and MiG-21s and MiG-23s from Estonia, although only the Sukhois would have even a slim chance of successfully intercepting the American aircraft. The greater Soviet threat came from the MiG-25s stationed at Finau-Översvård in the DDR. The Swedes noted that the Soviets usually would send a single MiG-25 Foxbat from Finau to intercept the SR-71 on their way back out of the Baltic Sea. With the Blackbird flying at 22 kilometers, the Foxbat would regularly close to an altitude of 19 kilometers, precisely 3 kilometers behind the SR-71, before disengaging. The Swedes interpreted this regularity as a sign that the MiG-25 had successfully simulated a shoot-down. The Swedes themselves would typically assert their neutrality by dispatching Saab 37 Viggens from Ängelholm, Nyköping or Ronneby. Limited by a top speed of Mach 2.1 and a service ceiling of 18 kilometers, the Viggen pilots would line up for a frontal attack, and rely on their state-of-the-art avionics in order to climb at the right time and attain a missile knock on the SR-71. Precise timing and target illumination would be maintained with target location data supplied to the Viggens fire control computer from ground-based radars, with the most common site for the lock-on being the thin stretch of international airspace between Åland and Gotland. Out of 322 recorded Baltic Express sorties between 1977 and 1988, the Swedish Air Force claims that they succeeded in attaining missile knock on the SR-71 in 51 of them. However, with a combined closing speed of Mach 5, the Swedes were reliant on the Blackbird not changing course. On the 29th of June, 1987, an SR-71 was on a mission around the Baltic Sea to spy on Soviet postings when one of the engines exploded. The aircraft, which was at 20 kilometers altitude, quickly lost altitude and turned 180 degrees to the left and turned over Gotland to search for the Swedish coast. Thus, Swedish airspace was violated, whereupon two unarmed Saab JA-37 Viggens on an exercise at the height of Vastavik were ordered there. The mission was to do an incident preparedness check and identify an aircraft of high interest. It was found that the plane was in obvious distress and a decision was made that the Swedish Air Force would escort the plane out of the Baltic Sea. A second round of armed JA-37s from Ängelholm replaced the first pair and completed the escort to Danish airspace. The event had been classified for over 30 years, and when the report was unsealed, data from the NSA showed that multiple MiG-25s with the order to shoot down the SR-71 or force it to land, had started right after the engine failure. A MiG-25 had locked a missile on the damaged SR-71, but as the aircraft was under escort, no missiles were fired. On the 28th of November, 2018, the 4 Swedish pilots involved were awarded medals from the USAF. Initial retirement, edit. One widely conventional view, and probably the best known view, of the reasons for the SR-71's retirement in 1989, a view that the Air Force itself offered to the Congress, was that besides being very expensive, the SR-71 had become redundant anyway, among other reconnaissance methods that were ever evolving. However, another view held by various officers and legislators is that the SR-71 program was terminated owing to Pentagon politics, and not because the aircraft had become obsolete, irrelevant, too hard to maintain, or unsustainably expensive. Graham, a former 1st SRS and 9th SRW commander, presented in 1996 what he viewed as a factual summary, not an opinion, of how the SR-71 provided some intelligence capabilities that none of its alternatives, such as satellites, U-2s, and UAVs, were providing in the 1990s, when the SR-71 was retired and then re-retired from Air Force reconnaissance duty. The chief question for opinion, beyond that point, was only how crucial, or disposable, those unique advantages properly were. Graham noted that in the 1970s and early 1980s, SR-71 squadron and wing commanders were often promoted into higher positions as general officers within the USAF structure and the Pentagon. In order to be selected into the SR-71 program in the first place, a pilot or navigator, RSO, had to be a top-quality USAF officer, so continuing career progression for members of this elite group was not surprising. These generals were adept at communicating the value of the SR-71 to a USAF command staff and a Congress who often lacked a basic understanding of how the SR-71 worked and what it did. However, by the mid-1980s, these SR-71 generals all had retired, and a new generation of USAF generals mostly wanted to cut the program's budget and spend its funding on different priorities, such as the new B-2 Spirit strategic bomber program. Such generals had an interest in believing, and persuading the services and the Congress, that the SR-71 had become either entirely or almost entirely redundant to satellites, U-2s, incipient UAV programs, and an alleged top-secret successor already under development. Graham said that the last mentioned one was only a sales pitch, not a fact, at the time in the 1990s. The USAF may have seen the SR-71 as a bargaining chip to ensure the survival of other priorities. Also, the SR-71 program's product, which was operational and strategic intelligence, was not seen by these generals as being very valuable to the USAF. The primary consumers of this intelligence were the CIA, NSA, and DIA. A general misunderstanding of the nature of aerial reconnaissance and a lack of knowledge about the SR-71 in particular, due to its secretive development and operations, was used by detractors to discredit the aircraft, with the assurance given that a replacement was under development. Dick Cheney told the Senate Appropriations Committee that the SR-71 cost $85,000 per hour to operate. Opponents estimated the aircraft's support cost at $400 to $700 million per year, though the cost was actually closer to $300 million. The SR-71, while much more capable than the Lockheed U-2 in terms of range, speed, and survivability, suffered the lack of a data link, which the U-2 had been upgraded to carry. This meant that much of the SR-71's imagery and radar data could not be used in real time, but had to wait until the aircraft returned to base. This lack of immediate real-time capability was used as one of the justifications to close down the program. The counter-argument was that the longer the SR-71 was not upgraded as aggressively as it ought to have been, the more people could say that it was obsolescent, which was in their interest as champions of other programs, a self-fulfilling bias. Attempts to add a data link to the SR-71 were stymied early on by the same factions in the Pentagon and Congress who were already set on the program's demise, even in the early 1980s. These same factions also forced expensive sensor upgrades to the SR-71, which did little to increase its mission capabilities, but could be used as justification for complaining about the cost of the program. In 1988, Congress was convinced to allocate $160,000 to keep 6 SR-71s and a trainer model in flyable storage that could become flight-worthy within 60 days. However, the USAF refused to spend the money. While the SR-71 survived attempts to retire it in 1988, partly due to the unmatched ability to provide high-quality coverage of the Kola Peninsula for the U.S. Navy, the decision to retire the SR-71 from active duty came in 1989, with the last missions flown in October that year. 4 months after the plane's retirement, General Norman Schwarzkopf Jr. was told that the expedited reconnaissance, which the SR-71 could have provided, was unavailable during Operation Desert Storm. The SR-71 program's main operational capabilities came to a close at the end of fiscal year 1989, October 1989. The 1st Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron, 1 SRS, kept its pilots and aircraft operational and active, and flew some operational reconnaissance missions through the end of 1989 and into 1990, due to uncertainty over the timing of the final termination of funding for the program. The squadron finally closed in mid-1990, and the aircraft were distributed to static display locations, with a number kept in reserve storage. Reactivation, edit. From the operator's perspective, what I need is something that will not give me just a spot in time but will give me a track of what is happening. When we are trying to find out if the Serbs are taking arms, moving tanks or artillery into Bosnia, we can get a picture of them stacked up on the Serbian side of the bridge. We do not know whether they then went on to move across that bridge. We need the data that a tactical, an SR-71, a U-2, or an unmanned vehicle of some sort, will give us, in addition to, not in replacement of, the ability of the satellites to go around and check not only that spot but a lot of other spots around the world for us. It is the integration of strategic and tactical. Response from Admiral Richard C. Mack to the Senate Committee on Armed Services. Due to unease over political situations in the Middle East and North Korea, the U.S. Congress re-examined the SR-71 beginning in 1993. Rear Admiral Thomas F. Hall addressed the question of why the SR-71 was retired, saying it was under the belief that, given the time delay associated with mounting a mission, conducting a reconnaissance, retrieving the data, processing it, and getting it out to a field commander, that you had a problem in timelines that was not going to meet the tactical requirements on the modern battlefield. And the determination was that if one could take advantage of technology and develop a system that could get that data back real time, that would be able to meet the unique requirements of the tactical commander. Hall also stated they were looking at alternative means of doing